Hi, it's April 28th, 2023, and I'm honored to have top investigative journalist in the U.S., Heather McDonald. Heather,
Thank you.
can you tell us a little about your latest effort, book, incredible book, When Race Trumps Merit?
Well, it argues that we're at danger of tearing down the entirety of Western civilization based on a phony premise, which is that any institution that is not racially proportionate in its members, so if a cancer research lab is not 13% Black oncologists, that's a racist lab. It must be discriminating against Black oncologists. Or if a prison population has more than 13% Black prisoners, that's a racist criminal justice system. And so we are accepting the argument that the lack of racial proportionality in various institutions is per se proof of racism. And we're getting rid of whatever standards, whether it's academic standards, meritocratic standards, or criminal law standards that are resulting in that lack of racial proportionality. What I do in the book, I lay out the extent of this phony argument and how it's threatening our scientific medical progress, our arts institutions, our public safety. I provide a lot of data for the alternative explanations for why we still have racial disparities, which is a very large academic skills gap on the one hand between Blacks and to a lesser extent Hispanics on the one hand, and whites and Asians on the other, and a very large gap in criminal offending.
Absolutely. So, has that gap widened in the last number of decades? Was it narrowing prior?
Well, there's some evidence that was narrowing a little bit. I think the SAT scores were narrowing a little bit in the 80s, but all that progress is ground to a halt. And yes, I think recently some of the K through 12 objective standardized tests have shown in places like California that actually the gap is widened. In the coronavirus insanity, you definitely did see there too that Black scores were hurt the most by the shutdown of schools. So that's probably widened the test score gap as well, which is going to haunt us for decades to come, because we are already insistent on saying that if Blacks are not succeeding academically, it must be because of racist standards. So let's tear down the standards. And if that gap widens, we're going to be even more frenzied to tear down those standards.
No, and it's a vicious cycle, as I think imply. Um, there was an item in the news recently that a student had received offers of $9 million in scholarships. And I assume that's spread over multiple universities. And year after year, we see a student gets into every university he applies to, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, so forth. And you don't necessarily really have to look to see that it's going to be an exceptional student, but almost by necessity, logically, a Black student. And the offers come in because it's kind of not so much that schools are kind of deferring against Black students, but frankly openly hungry for them. And the excellent Black students are in high demand. Um, what do you understand about some of the complaints of Black students on campus of oppression, of being negated, of being, um, you know, I guess erased and so forth? How do you see this dichotomy?
Well, the complaints are absolutely ridiculous. There's not an institution in human history that is not more open and tolerant and welcoming towards history's traditionally marginalized groups than an American campus. And they are exercising these vast racial preferences on behalf of so-called underrepresented minorities, which is Blacks, Hispanics, and American Indians. And they're discriminating against, above all, Asians and white applicants in order to make space for massively less qualified Blacks and Hispanics. Faculty hiring, it's the same thing. Every single faculty search, whether it's in economics, sociology, psychology, uh, engineering, medicine, it is all one desperate effort to find even remotely qualified minority candidates that are not Asian to interview and hire. And also there's a big scramble after females as well. So the idea that Blacks are being admitted into a racist institution is ridiculous, but it is the case that they don't do as well as their peers, and they may feel psychologically under assault, but the reason is because of these vast racial preferences. So it's a vicious cycle. The schools admit students that are not competitively qualified with their peers. I'm not saying, nobody's saying Blacks shouldn't go to college. They're saying they should go to schools for which they're on the same academic level as everybody else, not catapulted one or two tiers of selectivity above their qualification level. But when that happens, they can't keep up. And the data is absolutely indisputable that they end up at the bottom of their classes. Law school, it's just stunning. 51% of Black law students end up at the bottom 10% of their class after their first year. 2/3 of law students are at the bottom 20% of their class, all thanks to racial preferences. So they struggle, they don't do well, and then the diversity bureaucracy sweeps in and says, well, the reason you're feeling overwhelmed here is because you're in a racist institution. The solution is more diversity hiring, more diversity bureaucrats, and more racial preferences in admissions. So there's more Black students here, so you have a critical mass of students. Well, that means lowering standards further, so you're dipping further down into the applicant pool, creating a larger mismatch. It's an absolutely perverse, vicious cycle.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, do you have any examples of people advancing their career in a fashion opposite from Liz Warren?
Right. I mean, I don't know anybody that is Black that's going to go around saying he's white. If you're a Black high school senior, you'd nobody, believe me, is putting down his race as white. There's a lot of white males out there that I'm sure are wondering if they can possibly get away with putting their race down as Black, because that will confirm an enormous advantage on them.
No, it's a funny thing. Now, I also am wondering whether the NBA or the NFL have come under the same kind of race, kind of, I guess, matching society's racial structure on their teams. I think sport. I mean, I enjoy sports. I enjoy playing to a certain extent, but watching, and it's a genuine meritocracy. You can't stay on the team unless you can play. And 1,000 years ago in the '80s, there was I guess a diversity coordinator in the town I had my medical practice, and anyway, we wound up in this discussion, and she thought there should be disabled people allowed on the Celtics. Interesting, and but you just never hear that. Well, for those two leagues, they're very lucrative, well paid, but no, you don't really hear much talk that there need to be a certain number of Cambodians or um, or let alone American whites on a basketball team, of which there are very, very few. Um, has that ever come up? Do people like ever bring the analogy of sports meritocracy to these other institutions?
Well, conservatives raise this issue every time it gets talked about, and I've never heard a liberal institution explain it. I can guess they would say, well, they would just distinguish it. They would just say, well, sports, it's not a racist standard. It's a colorblind standard. It's meritocracy, but the medical college admissions tests, those are racist. So anything that has a disparate impact, it's sort of reverse reasoning. If it has a disparate impact on Blacks negatively, then it's racist. And if it doesn't, then it's not racist. So I
Right.
think they would just on an ad hoc basis
Right.
distinguish them.
And it's just to keep with the sports analogy for a second. Venus and Serena Williams, as well as Tiger Woods, both had demanding fathers, and well, well, three, I guess, had demanding fathers, and in both sets of parents, they started their kids young, and they pushed and pushed and pushed them, and so forth, and they excelled. They're iconic. Serena probably more than Venus, and Tiger is in a class by himself. Emotional issues and psychological issues aside,
Yeah.
um, but they started very young, and whether they are prodigies and naturally talented or pushed to that is an open question. But some of the work you bring out points out that a lot of our characters and our trajectory are potentially locked in an early age. So Tiger Woods was toying with a golf ball. You can see videos at 3 or 4 years old, and his feel for that ball is really kind of locked in early on. There's no way at whatever age after that, 15, 20, 30, whatever, that I start golf, and I started I think in my 40s, that I'm ever going to approach that kind of natural feel to it. And so for other things like puzzle solving or I guess um, drama or any bunch of other things that coincide with kind of the academic world, does one have a possibility if you have, say, started out in a household without conversation, without cohesion?
Well, there may be random examples of a child who is, so brilliant, such a prodigy that he can transcend a home environment. But on average, no, the results are very clear. And it matters what parents do. On the other hand, there's also a whole lot of psychological literature emerging that's saying it doesn't matter what parents do. The genes are all, and peer groups are more important than parents. That's a very hard thing for me to swallow. I would think that certainly developing habits of self-control, deferred gratification, uh, trying to conform to bourgeois norms, respect for authority, those do need to be inculcated because they're not natural to human beings. We're naturally self-involved and power seeking and
Mhm.
want to break rules on our own on behalf. So we can see such massive differences in child rearing cultures between Asians and blacks, say. It strikes me as just absurd to think that those differences do not play a very large role in our outcomes, and it's just grotesquely premature to say that it's racism that means that blacks, that results in the fact that blacks that grow up in these communities where marriage has disappeared, where the anti-acting white ethos is prevalent, where there's
Right.
no emphasis on paying attention to your teacher, doing your homework, staying out of gangs, that somehow we would expect these students, the children that grow out of those environments, to nevertheless end up proportionally represented in medical schools and engineering labs. That's just an absurd proposition.
Yeah, well, they can be, if you make it so.
Right.
Um, and so this is, I'm going to maybe segue to some of the specifics within your book. I mean, your book is probably a collection of essays, and I really love your work in the City Journal um, and the Manhattan Institute. Um, and there's different parts. I mean, I think they have a cohesive aspect to them, but let's kind of stick with medicine and the NIH. First, medicine. So I'm a medical doctor, and I remember medical school, and I was awake for a good part of it. Well,
I'm glad.
I tell people that because I actually was paid. I was the audio visual guy early on, and so a lot of people skipped lectures and slept through them and so forth. I didn't have that luxury. I was struggling. I was kind of relatively the lower income family, and anyway, uh, there's actual structural changes happening within the educational curriculum, from what I understand, and from what I've learned and gleaned from your book. Can you describe what is happening? What's the impetus? Where is it going? What's it going to result in?
Well, yeah, medical education is being radically revamped for the same impetus as everything else I write about, which is disparate impact, which is that meritocratic standards in medicine have a disparate impact on Black students and on Black professors, faculty members, and doctors. And so we've decided to get rid of those standards. Uh, so Blacks score much lower on the medical college admissions tests, which are the standardized score tests that people take to get into medical school. They're the counterpart of the SATs, which are taken in the 12th grade. Um, and there's, the Black students with sort of below average, mediocre MCATs and GPAs are being admitted the same scores that would be virtually automatically disqualifying if presented by a white or an Asian college senior, so that blacks with a sort of mediocre profile have a 9 times higher chance of being admitted to medical schools than their white and Asian counterparts. But once there, they still don't do very well. So medical licensing exam is being changed. And let me say the MCATs, far from being racist, they're not racist. They've been scoured for racism for decades. There's no questions about a regatta on them. And they've actually put in irrelevant questions about sort of psychological functioning or connectedness, just in order to hope that they can get higher test scores out of blacks, and that hasn't really worked. But the part one of the medical school licensing exam, which comes after the second year of a medical student's education, that is testing what he should have learned in classes about physiology and anatomy and drug functioning. It used to be graded, so A, B, C, D, but now it's gone pass fail for the same reason, because blacks weren't doing well on it, and their bad scores on the step one of the licensing exam was hindering them getting their preferred placements as residents. And the curriculum is also changing, as you say. We're putting in required courses in, anti-racism, intersectionality, white privilege theory, and it's all zero sum. Every moment that a medical student is learning about these ridiculous nostrums about inherent bias, implicit bias, is time that he's not spending learning about drug interactions and how to save somebody who's just been in
Yeah.
a terrible car
No,
crash.
my understanding is a lot of it's cutting into third year clerkships. Um, a little bit like probably high school or college. There's some gliding for your last year. It's kind of got that lame duck thing. So your last year of high school, you've already made your college applications. Your last year of college, things are already in the book. Your last year of medical school, things are pretty much decided. You've already, set in for the match, and you do some of these clerkships are a little more exotic and so forth. But third year, in probably all those scenarios, is really a crucial one, and that's where you learn subject by subject the major stuff and the stuff you should need to have no matter what specialty in which you wind up. And and I gather I'm not closely in touch with medical school per se. We had a reunion. I think it's my 33,000th reunion or something like that. My 100 years ago I was there, but um, they're taking away some from the actual clinical experience of what you're doing. The first 2 years is you're sitting down, mostly taking courses, some anatomy, standing up, but the clerkships are when you actually are doing hands-on stuff. You have to do
Yep.
clinical thinking,
Yep.
and just avoiding the results. I mean, it seems over and over again that there's one line drawn of one type or another, and some people are able to cross, and some people are not. So they just redraw a line.
Yeah.
I don't think that helps anything. If we do use a sports analogy, there's a movie, literally white men can't jump, and whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that does speak to, say, some potentially genetic differences, or hybridization of recent generations, whatever you want to call it. It's very possible that blacks on average can jump higher than whites. So if we had a jumping contest or whatever other contest, and some group of students didn't do as well as the other, would you change the bar? Would you have the Olympics be variable depending on somebody's upbringing or ethnic background? I don't know. I mean, I gather that these absurdities are not kind of sinking in, and everyone's just kind of moving along with it. What is, even lemmings have been mischaracterized as jumping off en masse. This was I don't know if you know about this, but this is one of these misinformation things, and it
Yeah.
got promoted, and it was a filming angle, and they just kind of made a loop out of it. And these lemmings, and I feel sorry for the lemmings. I've never met one. I think they're like chipmunks or something, but lemmings don't even do this, but yet we are. What is the
Mhm.
thing we're doing? What's the cultural, I think there's that guy, mass formation psychosis or whatever, but you can't imagine this is happening all throughout the university. I thought it was filled with smart people. What's to quote Saturday Night Live? What's up with that, Heather?
Race. It's all about race. Americans are very guilty about our racial past, and they see that the racial skills gap hasn't closed much, and they're terrified that it won't. And they're proleptically coming out with the only allowable explanation for the persistence of that gap, which is systemic racism. They don't want to look at Black inner city Black culture. For some reason, if you talk about that, that's racist. And Americans are terrified to be accused of being racist. And they sure as hell don't want to even consider the possibility of heritability. So we've decided that we would rather tear down meritocratic standards than have the neutral, colorblind, constitutional application of those standards if that results in some groups on average doing better than others. Now, as I say in the book, just because we have to talk about group averages doesn't mean that there's not thousands of Blacks who are way outperforming whites and Asians.
Absolutely.
And you can't really know anything about an individual until you know the details. On the other hand, let's be perfectly honest. If anybody is remotely familiar with the disparities in crime commission in this country, I mean, a study came out recently that showed that in the first 18 months after what it called the coronavirus pandemic, I would say what it really means is the time after the George Floyd race riots, the disparities in the rate at which Blacks and white juveniles died of gun homicide was 100 times. So Black juveniles die of gun homicide at 100 times the rate of whites. Those are average numbers, and they
Killed
explain
by whom?
other Blacks overwhelmingly. They're not killed by the police, they're not killed by whites. If they had been killed by other whites, we would have heard about every single one of those shootings. The reason we've heard about virtually none of them is because they're all killed by Blacks.
Yeah, so sort of a craven. Um, I I know you're the English major, and I'm not. I was a chemistry and physics major, but one of the one of my seminal reads was Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, and I have you read it?
Yeah.
So it seems like we're playing this out. I didn't know he was writing. I mean, in the way he was writing a history of the times, and I think literature has this. It is history in a sense. It's interpretive of what's going on. It's filtered through one of the most amazing things on the planet, human imagination. Um, Maybe would you mind speaking to the essence of literature? Um, I get maybe that's a little too early to segue there. Um, let's stick with the science theme, and I'd like to come back to that because I really would like to leverage your knowledge as um, as frankly a cultural critic. What is happening in the realms of science um, is you have a piece on the NIH, and we've talked a little bit about that. What's happening not just in universities but throughout the government? What's happening with science, and what's going to happen after?
Well, the government has decided that the racial demographics of a research lab is more important than whether it has the best qualified scientists working for it. So the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, uh, uh, the Public Health Organization, they've all put out now requests saying if you want to get federal funding for your research, you've got to show us that you are making very concerted efforts and ideally successful ones to recruit Black and Hispanic and other so-called minoritized individuals to your labs, not based on merit, but based on race. And we're actually changing the focus of our science research just in the hope that we can give out more grants to Blacks. So the NIH is shifting its research funding from pure science. The pure science is what's studying the trajectory of cancer throughout the body or within a cell, how electrons fire in and neurons fire in the brain to try and understand Alzheimer's disease, or basic physics research or engineering, all the amazing fields of nanotechnology. It decided it was going to do less of that and more research on health disparities and racism. So it's sort of applied public health type stuff, not because it's made a objective judgment that, well, in the long term, humanity will be better served by doing racism research. It's just that Black doctors, when they graduate, if they're going into a research career, they do more on the non-pure science front of research in health disparities and racism than pure science. And so we'll fund disparities research because that will allow us to fund more Blacks. And that's just a perverse thing to do. It
You
is
know,
not the
and it's up and down the government sphere. I've tapped into some of these lectures. I shared with you something at the National Library of Medicine. It's about decolorizing the COVID whiteness. There was another lecture on queer this and that. Um, Physicians in China. It was all one racial-ish thing or intersectionality subcategory or another. But I just want to interject slightly. Um, you were talking about heredity. I'm not sure it's all heredity. I think it's not so much color or your specific genome color, but culture. Nigerian. I listened to your interview with Brendan O'Neill um, on this book, and um, he talks about in the UK that blacks from Africa do better than blacks from the Caribbean. Um, Blacks from Nigeria do better than not just local, kind of post slavery long term blacks here, but they do better than whites on average. It can't necessarily be race per se, or even genetic heritage. Nigerians are more African genetically than American blacks, say 100% versus whatever a different number that is. Um, uh, anyway, as far as what's happening science-wise, uh, how is this contortion going to work out in the higher realms of science and physics and so forth?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that the culture is so bad that we should focus on that. And given how toxic heritability is, one can bracket that. I would say, though, that with regards to, say, Nigerians, we're getting the very elite.
Hmm.
It's not a population average that we're seeing. So you're comparing apples to oranges. But I'm not going to die on that mound or whatever, on that sword for that, because I'm happy to stick with culture. But what this is going to do for our scientific progress is slow it way down. We are turning away from the most talented scientists and saying, well, your diversity, equity, and inclusion statement is not sufficiently vibrant or enthusiastic, or you haven't shown us how you will create a diverse, happy lab, as the Howard Hughes Medical Institute
Hmm.
puts it. And so therefore, we don't even want to look at you. Meanwhile, China is racing full speed ahead, unapologetically meritocratic,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
will, the rate
The-
at which its universities are closing the gap with ours is very high. We still have, as an absolute number of universities, ours are still rated the highest, but I don't think we should be at all sanguine that we can retain that competitive edge.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit of is a Potemkin village in a sense. I hang out sometimes near MIT or at MIT, and the most kind of hardworking, diligent students there are Chinese nationals, it seems.
Yeah.
Um, and so the Chinese are working hard in their universities and they're working hard in our universities.
Yeah.
And it seems that we have somewhat diverted. I forget the name of that cycle where hard times lead to strong people bring good times lead to weak people lead to hard times or something, whatever. You remember that one?
No, I
Uh,
never heard that.
oh, anyway, so it's a little cartoon, but it's a useful cycle, and I think
Yeah.
we're on the downside. Does China? It's kind of a you know maybe an easy question. Does China worry about the lack of diversity in Chinese institutions? Does any other country worry about the lack of X in their Y?
Well, the Anglosphere is very obsessed with diversity, and they are with regards to females, but also to a somewhat lesser extent than here, just because they don't have the large Black population that we do. But they are definitely lowering standards, but China doesn't. Now, for all I know, China has other problems. I do tend to romanticize China because I believe in meritocracy is the most important value. And as far as I know, it is proceeding meritocratically, although perhaps there's huge preferences for Chinese Communist Party members in the nation's schools. But by and large, it's brutal. The competition is brutal. Everybody studies for a single exit exam to determine whether they go to college and which elite colleges they go to. It's a lot of stress, and people can say, well, it's just too much stress. But if you can buck it, you are really giving yourself a very, very strong preparation.
Yeah.
And so I don't think they don't have a strong female-centric feminist movement there. I don't think they've got a lot of gender pressure there either. It may come, and they may have the gay rights movement, and the females may start deciding that they should be 50% in all STEM fields, which is ridiculous because males and females have different interests on average, and at the tail ends of the curve, there's a lot more math dummies who are male and a lot more math geniuses who are male than females.
Right. There's also kind of allocation of resources. I mean, I think most everybody I've met was born of a woman. Um, and so even some of your, you know, say preternaturally talented physicists might want to take, time to do the mommy track. You never know.
Right.
So there's just kind of a differential in what gets kind of played out. You also kind of had to, a lot of. I mean, it's a great book and a great read, and you are a marvelous writer, and you write concisely and clearly. Um, but one of the more terrifying parts in general was kind of this science push. I forget the name of the office. It's kind of the chief physics officer of the U.S. Deciding on things for nuclear weapons and other kind of military aspects and so forth. And they wound up choosing somebody from UC Merced. Can you discuss that
Yeah,
a little
this
bit?
is in the energy department, and people always say, oh, well, they put Rick Perry as head of the Department of Energy. No, this is not the head of the Department of Energy. Within the Department of Energy, there's something called the Office of Science, which does huge grant making. I think it's the largest scientific grant maker in the federal government. And traditionally, it has focused a lot on nuclear technology, and the people that have been the heads of the Office of Science in the past, have had very stellar careers in physics and in running large scientific organizations. So, if climate change is your thing, this is a place that is looking into how to figure out green solutions to carbon emissions. Or nuclear weapons and nuclear technology generally. So in comes the Biden administration making diversity even more of a priority than it was under Barack Obama. And so it shows as its head of the Office of Science, who's going to have to be setting priorities, making scientific judgments about what the office should pursue, is a soil geologist from the University of California at Merced. UC Merced is a diversity school. It was created based on no need for additional research capacity within the University of California. Arguably, UC is already oversaturated. UC Merced was created simply in the hope that since it's located in the central agricultural valley of California, it would have a heavily Hispanic population. So this woman who's a soil geologist there, which is not physics, the argument is, well, there's methane gases produced in soil geology by
Yeah.
microbiomes, and therefore it has a bearing on climate change. But frankly, she is outrageously unqualified. She's her only uh, uh, bureaucratic experience was being chair of a department. And then she's got, if you look at her bio, it's all about diversity, and she's talks about sexism in science. So she is completely unqualified for this job, and so we'll just have to hope that she's willing to delegate authority to people
Right.
under her who are qualified.
Right. So this often happens with these minority quota contracts. The city of Boston, various times, um, had minority necessity in order to bid. There's a famous, well, I don't know if it's famous. I read it when there were still newspapers. It's probably about 20, 25 years ago. Um, somebody, a white guy, applied for a contract, um, and he said he was a minority, and they gave it to him. And then they said, "Oh my God, he's white." So they tried to take it away from him, and he said, "Well, if you look at the demographics at the time, there was this is anyway." He pointed out that whites were not in a majority; they were perhaps a plurality, but they were in the minority. And it may not have been Boston. I apologize, but whatever city it was, he argued that whites were no longer a majority. Therefore, if they're not a majority, you're a minority. And so thereupon they gave them a contract, they let him work, but then they changed the rules to be more specifically ethnic based. So that's not really leading anywhere per se. But the other, I want to kind of bring things together. You bring a big focus to the arts. Why is this important? Um, what's it about? What's happening in our museums, the concert hall, and so forth. Does anybody care? Should we care?
Well, if you don't care about the arts, I feel sorry for you. You're missing out on a lot. You're missing out on a lot of human experience that you would never otherwise have access to. Uh, Artists traditionally have been those that see into the dilemmas of human life and loss and sorrow and love and eros and jealousy and wit with greater clarity than many of us, and have a capacity to express it, whether with words or paint or music, in ways that most of us simply are mute by comparison. And it's a way of expanding your human experience to go back into the 19th century and experience life on a Russian feudal estate, or into the medieval period and imagine yourself in a medieval romance epic, allegorical, or Greek tragedy, the terrors of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, struggling with revenge and how to create a state that is stable, that acknowledges justice and the rule of law, and just simply humor. So art matters. It's sad that one has to defend it, but certainly
No,
people are
we don't
less
have
and
to
less
defend it with
involved.
me. My wife and I were painters for a long time. We, love this kind of stuff. I just want to hear you articulate. I'm a big fan of Andrew Clavin, I mentioned earlier, and he feels as if art is the kind of uh, the pulse that runs through all of us, not just individually. And you kind of, just to quote Potter Stewart, you know it when you see it. I think he was talking about something a little bit more mundane. Um, uh, but what is happening? I mean, I've seen it. We have the MFA here, and we have a kind of a goddaughter. She's not officially so, but we take her to the museum, and she's probably 12 now. And she loves. I got to say, there's one bit of art that she really likes. She loves Hamilton, and it's really turned her on to American history. So we brought her to the portraiture wing, and
Hmm.
George Washington is there, and he's actually accompanied, lo and behold, by one of my old buddies, a guy who grew up and was bar mitzvahed in Brookline, but found out he was adopted as a young man. He found this out, and he found out that his mother was part Mohawk, I believe, and abandoned him or whatever, put him up for adoption. And so he's been pursuing his art career as a Native American, and he's done very, very well. And his piece was next to the George Washington portrait, the huge portrait. And there's a piece that's very kind of, we'll say, less artistic,
Mhm.
and basically goes over George Washington's dad's burning down Indian villages. And so this has been put side by side. I'm sure you've seen a lot of this side by side stuff. I was at the Mellon Center at Yale, um, and same kind of stuff going on. There's like you can't. It's basically no. You're not going to be able to look and concentrate at the work of art,
Right.
or contemplate the scene in time. What is the mood amongst art institutions? Is everyone on board with this? I mean, is it all French Revolution all the time? What's the deal?
Yeah, the directors are absolutely appalling. The director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Max Holein, he's declared that the Met's mission now is anti-racism and that they're going to pursue race narratives through the last 5,000 years of art. James Rondeau at the Art Institute of Chicago is even worse. He's an utter dope. And uh, it's everywhere. I haven't written yet about the MFA, but I was just there too, and they're doing the usual thing where the wall text on Dutch Baroque art, 17th century Golden Age art, inevitably claims that still lifes are really just portraits of colonialism because the riches of Holland at the time were based on exploitation in the colonies, which is a grotesque exaggeration. But it's teaching young people to see this art through the lens of resentment and victimology, and to have the kind of moral narcissism of thinking that your views are necessarily superior to anybody else's, and if people did not think exactly like you did in the past, then they are not worth engaging with at all. They are inferior people, and anything they may have accomplished is not worth paying attention to. So there are some curators that are leaving. Keith Christensen at the Metropolitan Museum of Art got in trouble with a lot of other staffers uh, by denouncing the tearing down of statues that we were seeing in the post George Floyd moment, and saying if France had done this across the board, France would have no more culture left. And so he basically he resigned, but I'm sure his life was miserable there. So the traditional curators are undoubtedly feeling the heat, but every new generation of curators that has been even more indoctrinated in art history school by identity politics um, is just pushing these museums further and further away from their core mission.
So, how did one Heather McDonald manage to go through Yale and Cambridge and Stanford um, intact, or did you?
Well, things weren't as political when I was there, and I was a liberal by default, but I wasn't political. So, but I was in college in the 70s, and identity politics hadn't hit. So I didn't have to be deprived of the greatest literature because it didn't match my gonads and melanin. And so the rot really set in the 80s. And although I studied deconstruction, which was itself a waste of time, but it was not identity politics. So,
Yeah. No, I had friends, friend in Brown. He was in a master's program in English, and that's when I had gone through Yale, not knowing about Derrida and Demas, and if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and deconstruction, three Ds. um, but when he told me about it, he was so enthralled, and I thought. I mean, I don't know if I had the word then, but I thought, oh my God, this is like, silly and jejune.
yeah,
It's like a first blush where you've kind of figured things out. Like, you close your eyes and nobody's there, and the world is only me. It seems so. You probably have better words for it than I do, but solipsistic, self-referential, silly. Um, I don't know. What 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 has gone on? I mean, I suppose you don't necessarily have to make money. I mean, if you're in the I once heard that it was better, Enron was a better proposition than Amtrak. Enron did X, Y, and Z badly, right? But they failed and they disappeared, and other companies learned from them. Amtrak did things badly and has continued to do so, keeps getting bailed out. I think universities fall more in the category of Amtrak than Enron. So, is failure an option? What is going to happen? When will things fail? Is the go woke, go broke? Who gets to go broke in the world of museums and universities and so forth? And is that part of the problem, that they don't have the mechanism of failure?
Well, some colleges are going out of business now because we have way too many colleges. Not, maybe 10% of our population should actually go to college. But as long as donors and alumni keep giving them money, uh, they will keep going. And unfortunately, I mean, somebody recently told me, even if there's a total alumni boycott for a lot of these major schools, they don't care about that either because their endowments are so huge
Mm.
and they'll just keep going. So it's very hard to know how to deplug them. I'm writing a piece now about Ken Griffin, who's a conservative who just gave $300 million to Harvard, which is absurd. It's antithetical to his values. But these rich businessmen are ignorant and they want the prestige that comes
Mm.
from giving money, and they're generous. It's not all self-interested. They actually believe that they're contributing to the furtherance of knowledge, I presume. But it's absolutely outrageous. Harvard did not need Griffin's money.
Right. You remember the Bass donation to Yale?
Yeah. I
So,
mean, that should have been the end of it. The faculty rose up and said, "Don't you dare create additional courses in Western civilization. You're interfering with our crusade against Western civilization. And even though this is not mutually exclusive with anything we're already doing, you're an evil white guy, rich guy, conservative that believes in passing on our inheritance. Bad, bad, bad." And they rejected it, and that was that, and nothing has changed since then.
hmm, hmm. So I think it was Ben Stein's dad, Herb Stein, said, "When things can't go on, they don't," or something like that. When something, I think you get the idea. Um, are we reaching that stage with museums? I mean, could you go over the docent issue, perhaps? Because I think that's very colorful. I'd actually like you to do all of them. I'm not going to have time. There's the Juilliard incident. I mean, all these things are incredible. Fidelio. You can pick A, B, or C. Beethoven. These are just incredible instances in the book. I commend people to read it. But maybe pick one you feel like chatting about.
Well, very briefly, because I do have to go. Um, you mentioned the docents. The Art Institute of Chicago, like many museums, had a docent corps. These are volunteer educators, people retired or maybe never worked, because a lot of them are women. And the Art Institute of Chicago, which is one of the great art museums in the world, in the 50s started a very strong volunteerism set of institutions led by females who had done a lot of good fundraising during a budget crisis. And they decided, well, let's look into museum education, above all for children. And at the time, the received wisdom was, well, you should have professionals educate children because they need to go to art history school or maybe ed school and figure out psychology and things like that. And these women, 1950s, suburban women or living in Chicago, said, no, we're going to do this ourselves. And they developed an extraordinarily rigorous training program to become a docent. You'd have to basically get what a master's of fine arts. It was the equivalent. You'd write papers, learn the collections, and very early on they did their whole diversity component. Well, we have to be able to know how to relate to kids that are coming in from the south side and west side of Chicago. And so they've educated thousands of children. Well, here's this James Rondeau, who I'd mentioned earlier, and he's got a new head of the so-called Women's Board, which is the organization within the Art Institute that oversees the docents and other forms of female philanthropy. And they look around and they said, oh my God, the docents, they're basically white women. Therefore, they have to go. We'll cull them. It's another example of the white culling that is going on across our society. So they just shut down the docent program. They said, we're going to have no more docents because they're too white. And so the museum voluntarily, deliberately deprived itself of, I can't even calculate how much free labor, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries that they were saving by drawing upon the philanthropic, charitable instincts of these women who just wanted to help others understand the beauty of art. And they said, well, we'll have 5 paid educators, but of course, they're going to be chosen based on anti racism credentials, nothing to do with art history knowledge. And they'll have to pay for them. And they will not, 6 versus 100, there's no way they're going to be able to provide the same coverage to students to expose them to the glories of the Art Institute's collection. And that's just happening everywhere. There's orchestras that are getting rid of their musicians because they're too white. Every racial preference program in admissions is basically white culling, because every time you hire an underqualified Black or Hispanic, you're making sure that you don't have a white or Asian there. And you have often institutions that are quite explicit. They celebrate the fact that they've been able to bring their white population down. So maybe our student body was 60% white. Well, let's give out a cheer because this year it's only 55% white. So we're doing really well. So if you're a white male now, a heterosexual white male, every institutional signal you're receiving is you're not worth anything.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
What are white men going to pick up? And I know you're rounding out the hour here,
Yeah, yeah.
so I'm gonna bring up your books as well, just in background, so people can see what they are and where to get them. Um, what should white men do about this?
Ideally, not be cowed by the charge of racism. Stand up for meritocratic standards as a general matter, not apologize for Western civilization, and demand that institutions start acting in a colorblind fashion, and don't allow yourselves to be pushed aside, and certainly don't demean the traditions that you have worked for, whether it's in the sciences or in literature or in law, in jurisprudence. Every time that you're either silent and somebody goes around trying to destroy those institutions on the phony basis of race, you're not only canceling yourself, but you're canceling the possibility of generations after you to achieve excellence.
Okay, I can't let you go till we talk just very 1 minute ish about the war on cops. This is a fabulous book. I've read this, and I think people are, they just hear the stories. I mean, I think it's I think you're an English major, but literature is powerful. Narrative is powerful. People buy the narrative more than they buy the truth. Tell us, do police disproportionately target Black men?
No, they don't, and I'm not going to go into the details now, but
All right.
everything police do is determined by crime. If you are using a population benchmark to compare police stops or arrests, that's the wrong benchmark. Police go where crime is happening, and Blacks commit crime at exponentially higher rates than whites. 100 times higher in the case of gun homicide among juveniles, 100 times higher.
Right.
So that means the police cannot, and
And
they're Black people shooting other Black people.
right.
If
And
if we want to care about Black lives, the
right.
police have to be in Black neighborhoods, and they have to arrest Black criminals.
And Black people, peaceable, law-abiding Black people, need safe communities. And it's a sadness that things have devolved. I mean, we can go for the genesis some other day. I'm going to just stop for a second. I just my self promo here. If you want to support the podcast, you can look in my book. There's a lot of not quite similar themes directly, but this is a case where science occurred according to politics. People wanted to have a new virus in northeast Brazil in order to bring equity. Believe it or not, the north of Brazil is kind of upside down from the U.S. Their north is hotter, darker skin, more Indios, poorer, and so forth. And doctors set out to find a virus, chikungunya, they were hoping for. So they formed a group called Chick V, the mission. The mission referred to the movie Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons, 1986, where the Jesuits were a conduit. They protected the Indians against the bad colonials, and so they adopted this Chick-fil-A the mission to find a virus so they could bring money and power and equity to Brazil's north. And they succeeded, but it turned out with Zika, and they were so forthright and gung ho about attributing a problem, microcephaly, which is a sad issue, but it's been forever that people have this. They'll continue to have microcephaly, babies with small heads on occasion, and they attributed a new harmless virus, frankly, to this other problem, and then they declared a pandemic. And these things have repercussions. In the case of Brazil, more than 150,000 babies were never born because of this. This probably that continues all through Latin America, maybe the world. I'm not sure the number. It's hard to guess, but 500,000 children didn't come to existence because of this panic. It dissipated, but nobody's ever retracted the premise. So that's my book. People can go check that out. I'm in your debt, Heather. Would you like any last words?
Nope. But I've got a new book out there, so it may be worth reading. I don't know.
Yeah. No. When race trumps merit, and I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. People can follow Heather at the City Journal, and please buy her book.